Well, thank you very much, and welcome to a live recording of the Herle Burly podcast. We don't use the word taping anymore. I do, but it's a little out of date. It's a live recording of the Herle Burly podcast. I'd like to thank Electricity Canada for having us here today. It's an important conference. It's an important subject, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. For the purposes of our conversation, we're going to be accepting the Canadian government's climate goals. 45% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030, net zero by 2050. Purpose of this conversation is not to debate those things, it's to talk about how they could possibly be accomplished. One of the many fundamental changes to our lives and economy that will be required is the electrification of everything that we now use fossil fuels for, combined with cleansing the electricity supply of any fossil fuel sources. This will require much more electricity being produced than we are currently do, eliminating gas and coal from the supply, getting that electricity to homes and businesses across the country, and getting consumers to trade their current vehicle for an EV, their furnace for a heat pump, while paying higher electricity prices. I've been paying a fair bit of attention to the climate debate in the country, and I have no idea how any of this could come to pass in the time frame specified. To answer that question, I've assembled an expert panel. One of the smartest people I know in the world is a guy named Peter Nicholson from Nova Scotia, and I've worked with Peter over the years, and whenever I want to appear reasonably smart about something, I talk to Peter about it. So when I was putting this panel together, I called him up and I said, who's the most interesting person in the country on this subject? And he said, Jason Dion from the Canadian Climate Institute. So I present to you with no expectations, the Mitigation Research Director of the Canadian Climate Institute, Jason Dion. Also with us is Shawn McCarthy, Senior Counsel at the Sussex Strategy Group. I met Shawn many, many years ago when he was the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and went on to become Senior Global Energy Writer for the Globe and Mail. So from those two perspectives, Shawn has a tremendous amount to add to this. He's kept following and working on energy issues now with Sussex. So it's really great that you're here, Shawn. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And lastly is my great old friend, Greg Lyle, opposite sides of the political aisle, but both of us are pollsters. Greg with his own company called the Innovative Research Group. I used Greg as my source of public opinion information for the Ontario election, most recently for the Herle Burly and the Curse of Politics. I think he's just one of the smartest and most respected people in our industry, and he's got a wealth of work in this particular area. So from the consumer adaptation and willingness to move side, Greg Lyle is here. So thank you. It's a great panel. Really looking forward to it. Let's break this up into chunks, starting with where we are on clean electricity capacity. Jason, I want to start with you. How much new sources do we need? What will they be? And critically, when will they come online?
Yeah, so great question. And so we took a look at this in our own research, and to support the amount of electrification that we're talking about, we are talking about using, by the time we get to net zero, by 2050, 1.5 to double the amount of electricity we're using today. So a lot of growth. But to enable that growth, we're going to need systems that are 2 to 3 times bigger. The reason being that these future systems will have higher shares of wind and solar, which don't tend to produce all the time. So it's a much, much bigger system. A lot has to change, a lot has to get developed. And to the question of what exactly it will look like, our research showed, looking across all the major modeling studies on this topic, that there's a bunch of different generation mixes are possible. Different technologies will compete. The policies we bring in to drive those will matter a lot, but I don't think we necessarily need to know exactly what it's going to look like going forward. Really, we need an all-of-the-above strategy because we need to go on growing this system.
And just to follow up for just a quick sec, where's it at? Where's it at? Are these things happening?
Well, I think one advantage that we can point to right away for Canada is that we already have an electricity system that is 80% non-emitting. And of course, this audience understands that very well. At the same time, we need to observe that in some provinces, that's a lot of hydro. In other provinces, that's a much more GHG-intensive system, more natural gas, some coal. So certainly challenges in getting those out of the mix, but we have a head start in that regard. Lots of work to do, though.
Yeah. Shawn, one of one of the things that always comes up is jurisdiction. So this climate policy is a federal policy, right? But the changes in the electricity production and distribution are going to be provincial in nature. Yeah. Not every provincial government in the country is as enthusiastic as the Trudeau government is about making progress on this. Let's just take a place like Ontario. Where is Ontario on the path to cleaning its grid?
Ontario is actually an interesting example. I think it's somewhere in the middle of, more aggressive provinces and less aggressive provinces. Ontario is planning to bring more gas onto the grid, partly because they have to retire, or they're talking about retiring. If they don't retire, they will have to rebuild Pickering Nuclear Station. But over the longer term now, they are talking about phasing out gas, and Ontario Power Generation has a net zero plan. So Ontario is somewhere in the middle. That doesn't mean there won't be friction between the feds and the provinces and the province of Ontario on how to get there and at what cost.
And where is the plan for this double the amount of electricity that Jason was talking about in Ontario? Where will double the amount of electricity come from?
Well, we haven't seen it yet. Certainly there is no plan in Ontario for double electricity, but it will require investment.
Can I stop you? You just say that kind of casually. Like 2030's less than 8 years away.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't think we need double by 2030. Jason can correct me. Yeah. I think we're talking 2040, 2050 for double, but still.
Still, we should be on it, shouldn't we? We should be on it.
We should be on it. And they are on it to a degree. I mean, the ISO in particular is making plans for this. I think there are a couple holes in the plan. Two big ones. One is there's not energy coordination. Three big ones. There's not energy coordination within the province. So you have the Ontario Energy Board that looks at natural gas and the consumer side of energy pricing. You have ISO. Do they talk? Not a lot. I think we really need better coordination. The government's supposed to be doing it, but really, do they have the technological prowess to do it? Questionable. And then you have the Fed-Prov thing that you're referring to. And then you have this distributed energy where there's huge potential for energy to be generated where it's used. And I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface of that. And as the technology advances, solar panels, for instance, become more and more efficient, that will become increasingly available.
Greg, people don't like distributed energy, do they? People would rather have all the electricity created at one place that's not close to their house and shipped to their house than they would have their neighborhood strewn with solar panels and windmills, would they not? Is there not some politics in this that get difficult?
I don't think that's true. I think it's certainly true that in Oakville and Mississauga, they would like not to have a gas plant next to them.
Right. I remember that.
Yeah, you may. But solar panels, storage, like the Tesla Powerwall, things like that, are things that people are open to. One of the big issues right now...
Sorry, there was a lot of resistance to wind early. Is that...
No, well, and I mean, the issue with wind is... you may recall at the time that we had a premier who said he wasn't going to let NIMBY get in the way until he did. And I think that there was some lack of realism. And I think one of the big challenges, if we're really going to make this work, is this is a sector that's very well informed about what's going on. But many of the people that govern them don't understand what everyone in this room takes for granted. And so we saw that with Nova Scotia, right? Nova Scotia has ratcheted back the rates from under 3% to even lower, which will not enable Nova Scotia Power to be able to build the assets they need for greening that grid and expanding that grid to allow for electrification. And so, often people will talk to me about, where's the public? Where do we need to bring the public? And I would say, well, think about it as a pyramid and ask yourself, are the people at the top, do they know what they need to know? because I think the secret to success here is going to be, number one, to make sure the people that can give permits, right? And then number two, to make sure that it's done in a way where they don't pay an exorbitant political price. And if we have that sort of mechanism, because the public themselves don't know very much, and it's unlikely that they will.
In terms of the makeup of what the new electricity mix would be, what the sources would be, there's hydro comes with some issues, nuclear comes with some issues, wind and solar come with some issues. Do people care? Like, does the public have a point of view about what ought to be the clean energy components?
They have preferences, but what they really want to see is a plan. They're also very open to the idea that there would be a diversity of sources. People find a lot of appeal in that. But I think the other thing that we need to remember, and this was discussed in one of the earlier panels, is the role of consumers as prosumers, right? So as you think about how can we will have to grow the amount of electricity that's available in the grid if we want to hit our goals by 2030. And the lead times of building industrial scale generation and storage, we're almost at a runway already. So where's the low-hanging fruit? The low-hanging fruit is actually prosumers, low volume customers that can install power walls, that can install small scale generation, but in particular the storage, right? The technology has moved a long way in storage, and we have the ability to take electricity capacity that we have at times of low demand, like the middle of the night or a cool day in the spring, store that for when we need it, and we can leverage the capacity of this big boomer generation that has all this money and has a commitment to the environment to put in place a bunch of storage that we can then use on the distribution system so that we're not as dependent on building these big industrial scale projects. We're going to need them,
right?
But we can manage in the meantime.
David, I want to jump in because these conversations always focus on generation, and rightly, I mean, we will require a lot of generation, but often lost in the conversation is the importance of managing our demand. And that's done a whole bunch of different ways. Energy efficiency, time of use, when are we using it? I just got at home a card from ISO, I believe it was, that talked about time of use. Don't run your dishwasher at 7 o'clock when everybody's got their lights on. Wait until after 7 o'clock. Wait until midnight. Don't run your washer machine. All these things, turn off your damn lights. I walk around my neighborhood, houses are lit up like, everybody's afraid of the dark. Turn off your light. Leave the room. That's what my mother told me.
You sound like a dad now, man. You sound like a dad now.
I know, I'm sounding like a dad, and you should hear my wife. But these are, I know you want to talk about sacrifice, and one of the things we sacrifice and are going to maybe have to sacrifice a little bit is convenience. And the idea that we walk in, we turn on the electricity at any time, it's there for us, and we don't have to think about it. And that's a big, and we need to, I know it's hard, and I'm sure Greg can talk about this, how hard it is to get people to think about it and make plans. But, it's a big part of the answer, and the cleanest and cheapest next megawatt of electricity is in energy efficiency and conservation.
Okay, excellent point. But despite your admonition, I'm going back to generation.
I knew you would.
I'm going back to generation.
I just wanted to get that in there.
You got that in there? Jason, hydro, like water power. Right? Newfoundland has a lot of it. Quebec has a lot of it. Manitoba has a lot of it. Is this a potential answer to our supply issue? And is it also a potential national unity federalism play at the same time?
I mean, the potential is huge. So other countries look at Canada with envy here, where every province that has a large hydro system is neighbor to one that would decarbonize with wind and solar. So the complementarity is there. The challenge is that these systems have been run fairly independently for a long time. The connections run north-south a lot more than they do east-west. So there's always been a case for better integration, but there's a lot of challenges and hurdles there. At the same time, the imperative to decarbonize really strengthens the case for doing it. So I think when we think about the potential there, it's tempting to think of it as this nation-building East-West project. In fact, what we might see that's a lot more likely is increasing coordination and integration among willing regional partners. So we're seeing that in Atlantic Loop, hurdles there for sure. But where there's not a lot of interest, perhaps it won't proceed as quickly. I think what's essential is that we have the analysis and the studies that show us what would it cost to not do it? What would it cost to do it completely alone versus integrate with your neighbors? And then let's make an informed decision about what we're going to do, and decision makers can be accountable to ratepayers and citizens for those decisions.
Right. Flipping back to you, Greg, though, I mean, I know that I saw research years ago that told me Ontarians were not excited about being hostage to Quebec for their electricity and preferred to have their own supply of it. And we saw what happened politically in New Brunswick a number of years ago when they tried to do a deal between New Brunswick Power and Quebec and Hydro-Quebec. Is there a willingness for people to suspend their own provincial supplies of electricity and have a national grid?
There's a surprising desire for self-reliance on provincial electricity grids. It's a very emotional thing. You see it all across the country, BC, Alberta, New Brunswick, Ontario. There's also just a practical reality that if you look at the near to midterm and you look at how much electricity Quebec is going to need, and the fact that Ontario is shifting from being a summer peaking load to being a winter peaking load, the opportunity in the midterm for a lot of sharing, certainly between Quebec and Ontario, I think is somewhat limited. Manitoba is interesting. Assuming that they could get permission to build the remaining projects that they have, and that list is shortening. BC has none left. The question is a smart move, if you think about global warming in an international context, to take that power from northern Manitoba and put it on long lines to serve Toronto? Or would it be better to do something like create green hydrogen and put it on ships and send it over to Europe, right? There's bigger questions, but that hydro resource, where it's in surplus, has some real potential with environmental costs, right? Because we lose habitat and there's a lot of cement that goes into these projects, so it's not zero, right? There's an environmental price to be paid for anything.
Right. Low-hanging fruit. All Herle Burlyites know this metaphor. We've probably used it. But despite its undeniable accuracy, I've always found it to be slightly off-putting. I mean, I just don't want my mind to wander to pears or figs in the middle of a strategic discussion. But I'll go with it here because I think it applies to our conversation on how long-term digital policy should be playing a big role in Canada's climate policy. Currently, it's not playing any role. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, believes digital policy is climate policy. It just seems unlikely that we can meet net zero emissions by 2050 unless the positive enabling role of digital technology is not only recognized but expanded upon. Our own behaviors are naturally headed in this direction. Think about how we're accessing healthcare. According to the Canadian Institute for Health Information, 73% of us had at least one virtual healthcare interaction at home. Those numbers are only on the rise. Almost 16% of us are working exclusively from home now, according to StatsCan, and 1.7 million Canadians have hybrid work arrangements. We're taking so many more of our classes online. Supply of electric vehicles can't meet current demand. And 51% of Canadian consumers shop online at least monthly, based on a 2022 survey by PwC. See, these are the low-hanging, carbon-reducing wins that TELUS believes can be amplified with the flawless connectivity and innovation that world-leading digital policy brings. But to take full advantage of this opportunity, Canada needs to lead our global peers by including digital policy as a foundational piece of our climate action plan so that we can reach our climate targets. To learn more about this kind of thinking and to support it, go to telus.com/digital policy for climate. Shawn, nuclear seems to be back in the discussion. It is. For probably the first 5 or 6 years of this Trudeau administration, they were allergic to the word.
Absolutely.
It was not part of any of their climate plans. The nuclear people would tell me they couldn't get invited to a meeting couldn't be part of a discussion. And all of a sudden, here it is. And it's not just SMRs, the small ones, but it's also people talking about it more broadly, its use in the country. I know a lot of people in this world who tell me that they think Ontario will have to build another large nuclear reactor, not an SMR, but a Darlington, Pickering, Bruce type of operation to meet the coming needs. But Darlington took like 12 years to build, right? Like if that's going to be part of the answer, how are we going to possibly get through all of the environmental approval processes, the siting issues, and then the actual construction in a time to be relevant?
Right, and one of the promises of the SMRs, and it's a bit of a misnomer in a way because you say small modular reactors, which is what SMR stands for, and everybody thinks really small. In fact, 300 megawatts is a SMR, yeah. and the prototypes that Ontario Power Generation is working with are about that level. So we talk about distributed power. It may be if SMRs live up to promise, and there are questions, that they are part of a distributed network where you have them in different smaller cities where you don't have to build transmission so far out, and it becomes viable. And it also, the modular part of it, the passive safety part of it, the regulator is already working on pre-approval of a lot of the designs so that work will be largely done when they're ready to start building. And then you still have site select reviews, and it will still be nothing gets done quickly, obviously, and it will be a challenge. But the modular part of the design also means that it's supposed to be built more quickly. Ontario Hydro, I keep wanting to call them Ontario Hydro, Ontario Power Generation has moved quickly on Darlington rebuild, and that's gone ahead. But there's a lot of capacity issues around the workforce, around all the supply constraints we've seen in industrial.
So you sound pretty skeptical about a big can-do being built. You don't sound like that's.
I'm not sure it could compete even in terms of cost against the other options of renewables and storage and some gas to back it up in the short term to medium term. And we'll see, but if you threw out a proposal to say we need 1,000 megawatts, what would be the most economically efficient choice? I'm doubtful it would be a large nuclear plant.
Right. Okay, Jason, wrap this generation segment up for us because I want to move on to the grid itself. But wrap this generation side up for us. What am I supposed to have taken from this? Are we anywhere close to be doing in this country what we need to do to meet the 2030 and 2050 targets? And if we're not, like, what would need to start happening now?
So to Shawn's point earlier, I mean, it really matters that the doubling and tripling we're talking about is not tomorrow, right? This is not next year. It's barely happening later this decade. But to be ready for what's coming, we absolutely have to begin now. And I think the missing piece when you look across the country is, there's climate policies being rolled out. There's these longer term commitments where we haven't necessarily laid a roadmap out for policy of how we would get there. That's creating a challenge for regulators, utilities, system operators. And the missing piece, I'm often told, is energy planning, to Greg's point earlier, that concrete plans for how governments plan to meet future demand, which mix of technologies they envision. This is something that we absolutely need. And that work is beginning, but I think it really needs to start to advance a lot more quickly. We need to set out some markers that then these institutions can actually then begin to pick a lane and start to make some decisions using these government energy plans. That's an absolutely essential piece of the puzzle.
In Ontario, the government has asked the ISO to look at how do we get to 2035 without gas. The first question was, how do we get to 2030? And the ISO said, very difficult. It would cost you $100 per month on the average bill. 2035 looks more doable, and they're working on that now. And the Minister of Energy has asked the ISO to report back on that. So, the wheels are turning.
Right. What are the political logjams here? I mean, it's a government that seems to be studying everything about this. They're producing plan after plan after plan. Where's this plan?
Well, I mean, we're increasingly in a political world where we have like a 4-hour horizon, like not a 4-year horizon, but like a 4-hour horizon. And this is a 20-year horizon. And, you know, if you go back in time and you ask yourself, when is the last time Canada as a country dealt with a big challenge like that cut across jurisdictions? I think the answer is the Canada Pension Plan. Right, which is like mid-90s. Yeah. Right, that we've gone 2.5 decades without governments able to come together on a big, complex challenge that involves sacrifice, because that did. It meant rates went up for a benefit that people wouldn't see for decades. But we did it. So we can do it. And the question is, will we do it here? And I would argue that the single biggest challenge we have right now is not public literacy, but leadership literacy. I think that a lot of the people in government, in fact, I think it's true of most governments, that nobody in a senior decision position in the government, whether it's elected or staff, worked in energy before they got into government. Right now, Alberta's an exception to that, but across the country, there are many, you can go into many cabinet rooms and look at the staff and look at the ministers, and none of them dealt with any of this stuff. They don't even know what a megawatt is, right? And they don't necessarily need to, but they need to understand the basics. And so I think one of the critical roles for organizations like Electricity Canada is to make sure that decision makers know the basics, that these issues are not because of a particular utility in a particular place made a particular mistake at a particular time, but that the overall world is changing. I think if we can, and that's a doable thing, because we're talking about a few thousand people and we have their names, addresses, and phone numbers, right? So we can actually focus on those people. Trying to educate 34 million people is virtually impossible. I mean, we've tried that in economic literacy, right? Financial literacy, where the stakes are high and billions of dollars are spent every year. And yet, if you look at core benchmarks of financial literacy, they rarely move. So anyhow, when I look at the political issue, I think the issue is that we have a long-term challenge for a system not aimed at long-term, and that too many decision makers just don't know the basics.
Challenge, Greg, just a little bit on the last time we did this. Actually, we did it after Paris. Right. We had a climate plan that was largely agreed to by the provinces. Bradwell, Saskatchewan was the exception, but the provinces came together, and they, by the end of 2016, signed off on a plan. That fell apart as soon as Rachel Notley lost power in Alberta, and the Liberal government lost power in Ontario, and we had some governments change. And the stars aligned perfectly for a partisan agreement on a climate plan. Will those stars ever align again? Once in 100 years, I suppose.
Maybe I'll just jump in with one more, which is that in the last couple of years, we have seen the federal government negotiate childcare agreements with the provinces. And it's an interesting parallel with electricity, where you're talking about federal funds being used towards provincially managed systems. And I think that should be the model for electricity. It is not about the federal government deciding what should be happening with provincial systems, but instead, significant federal funds that can help with the cost of these investments in exchange for a limited number of principles being adhered to, which has been the model for childcare, which is the model for healthcare. And it can be things like, commit to net zero by mandating your regulators to pursue it, develop your own net zero energy plan that you control and decide on. And really beyond that, not much. I mean, I think there is scope for a model where the federal government doesn't overstep and can facilitate and enable provinces to do this work because they control many of the levers.
Right. So I want to take a moment this week to talk about one of those people who bend history to their will. They walk among us, but they don't think like most of us. Charles Melville Hayes was one of those people. He was a railroader, born in the mid-19th century, and he died young. More on that in a moment. He started at age 17 as a clerk in St. Louis, Missouri. And as he rose through the industry, he conceived a great matter. establishment of a second transcontinental railroad in Canada, one that would run from the Maritimes to the West Coast, not to Vancouver, but to the northern BC town of Prince Rupert. Rupert is much closer to Asia than Vancouver. It also has the benefit of not being surrounded by a metropolis, so there's a lot more room to build out the infrastructure befitting an important seaport. Charles Melville Hayes pestered everyone, twisted arms, cut deals, and bought up land. His aggressive style landed him in the president's office at Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. Ottawa grew tired of him, but eventually struck a deal. A new line would be built from Winnipeg to Rupert. He died before it was finished, though. In 1912, he was in London, England, and anxious to get back to Canada for the official opening of the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. He boarded a ship from London to New York, joining the chairman of the White Star Shipping Company on board the RMS Titanic. He was last seen helping women onto the great ocean liner's lifeboats. They paused construction of the second railroad for 5 whole minutes in his honor, but it was eventually built. And Rupert today is a gem in the network of CN, our sponsor. Along with Vancouver, it is a crucial link to Asian markets. To say CN has great plans for Rupert is a gross understatement. Charles Melville Hayes, as I said, made a difference. Most Canadians might have never heard of him, but he affected our economy and therefore our lives profoundly. The city of Melville, Saskatchewan is named after him, not bad for a former railroad clerk. So is the city of Hayesport, British Columbia. And in Prince Rupert, where folks know what he accomplished, there's a school named for him and a statue. He's wearing a 3-piece suit and a fedora, and he looks entrepreneurial. Hayes' new cargo has to move, and boy, did he make that happen.
Okay. Now that probably leads really well into this distribution side of things. And I'm into areas I don't really understand, but I presume that if we're going to move, say, 2 times as much electricity, that requires some investment in the overall grid. Like moves it across Ontario. You see those big poles that move it all out of Darlington? I presume we need more of that around. But then there's the local aspect of it too, which is, I've got this anecdote in my head and I can't get it out, that somebody told me that if everybody on my block got an electric vehicle, there isn't enough electricity going to my block for everybody to charge their electric vehicle. So that's the most easy fundamental change, and we're not ready for that. So what has to happen, and I'll start with you again, Jason, what has to happen to that grid? And is it the utilities that have to do it? And have they started? Is that investment happening and I'm missing it, or is it just not started yet?
I mean, it's quite right that that part of the systems has to grow. But there's also the scope to be smart about this, so to take that electric vehicle example, if those electric vehicles charged overnight, if they're charging sort of switched on in sequence, then the build out of the distribution system at the local level would not have to be as big. Now, right now, the incentives and technology to do that are not in place. But to Shawn's point earlier, this is something that will have to happen, that ideally we are figuring out ways to do this. The relationship with consumers on this is gonna have to change. We might need to reward them for this, but at the same time, electric vehicles also present a new opening where I think people can understand that we're talking about such a large source of load that the idea that they wouldn't necessarily be able to charge it any time they wanted, or if they were, that they might pay a small premium for that luxury, I think people can wrap their heads around that. So work is beginning in this way. There's interesting things you can point to, like the fact that in the UK, the regulator has the authority to be able to require utility load control of when the electric vehicle turns on. So they're not even incentivizing, they've given themselves the power to require it. They're not using that power yet, but they've got it in place. So these things are gonna be increasingly happening. It's about how smart, the more intelligent we are about the policies and incentives we provide for this, the less the build out, less extreme that build out of the transmission and distribution system might have to be.
Is it happening right now?
No, I mean, it's beginning to, but it's not happening right now. I think, though, that, and I talked to Ottawa Hydro a while back about this, and they said, yes, we see what's coming. We will be making the investments. We will be preparing for it. You know, this is job one of the, well, it's not job number one. Job number one is keeping the lights on, but this is right up there in terms of their long-term plans. One of the big challenges, though, I mean, I live in West End, Ottawa. We had a storm here not that long ago. My neighbors 2 streets over were without power for a week. If you're suddenly, you need that to move your car and you need that to heat your home. So I think we're going to have to start figuring out backup. That Greg mentioned the power wall, the Tesla power wall, where you store. I mean, you can't store forever in the battery, but you can store for a while. I'd like to put solar panels on my roof. I'm such a technophobe that I'm even afraid to go down that road. But I would consider it if somebody could show me how to do it. Because I think as we electrify, we're going to need to figure out that distributed energy in our own homes so that we're prepared for lines going down when a squirrel gets electrocuted in a power box.
Greg, seems like we're in for a period of frenetic building because we're not where we need to be, and so there's going to be some catch up to do, both on building the grid, building new sources. I know, Jason, that you have a thought on this because I saw it in your video, so I'm going to hold you for a second. But when the Wynne government got into real trouble on electricity prices, and we tried to find a way to reduce them, one of the pieces of logic we went through is, to the extent that these prices are as high as they are because we're changing the mix of things for climate change, that's a broad public good. And it's not reasonable to ask the ratepayer to pay it. It's reasonable to ask the taxpayer to pay it. So generally, our electricity systems are based on user pay and cost recovery. Should that be the principle going forward?
Well, I think the issue is if you say, okay, what's the cost of having reliable, dependable power? That's perfectly reasonable to leave on the rates. But if the issue is how do we make it clean? Right now we're bringing a social good in. If you look at places like California, they brought public money into the picture to buy that public good. And I think given the reality of affordability being the #1 issue, given what we saw in terms of the government in Nova Scotia, I think one of the things the federal government needs to consider is there a way to use their dollars to buy the change they're looking for in the grid in a way that cushions the consumers from those impacts. But the other thing that I think is really important here is to put the consumer in the middle of this. So depending where you are, right now, if you put solar on your roof and you wanted to feed it into the system, there's certain places where the grid, in fact, most places, the grid can't take it. The grid wasn't designed to bring electricity on.
Right.
But even where it is allowing that to come in, it depends where you are on whether you're going to get paid on how much electricity you actually bring into the system. So there are situations where you could provide more than you take out of the system, but you won't get paid for that. It'll be a credit on your bill to a certain point, and then that's it. I think if you want consumers to be an accelerator to this change and not a potential barrier to this change, then we should say, well, if we're going to put X billion dollars into this, let's start by saying, can we get our bang by giving it to consumers, right? And if consumers look at this and say, I can actually make money, it's not like just the big guys in their fancy towers that are going to go out and get some sweetheart deal from my increased rates, but I can actually go out there and become a prosumer one way or the other, or I can get an incentive, some type of payment for turning my load off at peak times, right? Because you can automate that now. If you just, you can automate your air conditioner so it goes off every 15 minutes for 5 minutes and back on again, and that will shave peak at key periods of demand, and that's worth something to the grid. We should pay consumers for that.
Right. I think you agree with that, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the more upside we can create for consumers, the better. At the same time, it's going to be a challenge. The fact that the amount of investments we're talking about could lead to upward pressure on rates. So we did some analysis of what might happen to rates across provinces as we go about this transition. And there's some uncertainty, and it might go down in some scenarios, in some places, but in others it could go up, and it could go up significantly. And there are lots of reasons we want to avoid higher rates. Business competitiveness, affordability for households, and also incentives for electrification. The more expensive power is, the less incentive there is to electrify. So there are lots of reasons that we want to do this. And it's been our recommendation that, to your point, we start to see electricity as another category of infrastructure that we make public investments in. That we try to do that with an eye to shaving down the cost of electricity for ratepayers, because what that can offer is a way of, carbon pricing is a policy where we're making the price of fossil fuels more expensive. And this kind of policy, the funding of electricity systems using public money, can be the pull to the energy system of the future. So one is the push, the other is the pull, and they can be the other side of the coin to each other. So I think there's a model where the federal government does this. We did some analysis that looked at, well, in fact, if you paid for more electricity system investments out of the federal tax base, number one, it has a smoothing effect across provinces, that those with more expensive transitions, it smooths out who pays. It's also much fairer across the income distribution. Ratepayer cost recovery is a really unfair way to bear the cost of electricity system investments if you're a low-income household. Doing it through the tax system instead is more progressive. So there's lots of reasons to do it. And it's been our recommendation that the federal government see this as a way of driving provincial actions and also helping ratepayers at the end of the day. Because I think if that's not in the mix, public buy-in for this whole transition evaporates.
Do you hear that as part of the thinking in Ottawa, Shawn?
I don't know if it's part of the thinking in Ottawa. I think one of the challenges is, well, it's understandable. I'm sitting here thinking, one of the reasons we drive up prices is to discourage use and to get more efficiency and to get more conservation. So we want people to use more electricity, but we want people to use more electricity wisely, to my point of turning out your lights and trying not to use peak. And it's worth mentioning here that peak demand is such a critical component of this whole equation, because the electricity demand really swings during the day, and we need so much more supply at 6 o'clock at night than we do at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so this effort to get people off peak is really critical, and just for your audience to understand that. But yeah, I mean, if we're trying to encourage people to electrify, we can't make it too expensive to use electricity.
Right. We'll be back after a word from our sponsor, Google.
What's the latest news?
Beluga whales migrate to the Hudson by the
thousands of Ukraine refugees have come to
Canada. Housing prices slow down for the first
time to turn those clocks
back to a new normal as people roll up sleeves for the bivalent
vaccines for monkeypox available in some
provinces, looking to expand use of electric
vehicle identified in a hidden runoff from heavy rain is affecting
travel is opening up again across the country.
Google, connecting you to all that's news.
So again, where is the consumer in all this, Greg? I mean, you're more on top of it than I am, but I have to say that as a broad sweeping generalization, that I have not noticed in my research that the growing awareness and concern about climate change among the general public has been accompanied by any desire to pay more for services or to have a lower standard of living in order to fight climate change. So how do we get consumers to make the changes? What's going to make them buy cars? What's going to make them buy an electric vehicle?
Just the easy questions, right?
Yeah.
So I think what we need is a moment, right? And I think one of the things that I really liked about the governance model of the Ontario electricity system compared to elsewhere was the role of the Ontario Energy Plan, because it meant every 4 or 5 years, there was a moment where we had the political discussion and political direction was made. And then that made it simpler at the regulatory process to say, given that the plan has set these goals, this is where we're going to go. And I think that if we could have a moment like that, that if the federal government created a process that led to an agreement where the goals were clear, the focus was clear, and people understood what we had to do. Because this is, as a challenge, no less daunting than a challenge like World War II or World War I, right? In terms of the amount of effort it's going to take, in terms of the amount of cost. Now, and in terms of the consequences, like, I don't think we fully accepted or understood or taken on board the fact that if everyone does everything they promised at these international conferences, we've got 28 years of the climate getting worse before it starts to get any better, right? So I live in BC. I couldn't drive from BC to Alberta for weeks, right? Like I could not go to the rest of my country unless I flew. You know, if you lived in Alberta, right? You had the Calgary flood and you had, you know, the fire at Fort McMurray. And you can go across.
But they're not blaming that on F-150s in Alberta.
There you go. But they you know, that it is true that this current premier perhaps is not as understanding of this. But the average Albertan is not that different than the average Ontarian when you ask them what they think about climate change. And you saw the United Conservative Party did not reverse course from the changes that the NDP made in terms of supply mix in Alberta, right? They continued down that road because that is actually mainstream in Alberta. And what we see is that when we have detailed conversations with people about utility spending plans, when they see they are getting something for what they're paying, they support that plan. But you can't do that day in, day out, every day of the year. You can create moments, have that conversation, and everyone can move on. But the challenge in doing that is going to be, if we're raising rates for the average person, then the average person will deal with it. What about the people that are vulnerable? What's being done for them? And this is where the public dollars comes in, right? How do we make sure that we are not putting a disproportionate share of the burden on the people that are already having the hardest time in life?
Right, right.
And if I can just add to that in terms of the politics of all this, that what's interesting about electricity in this is it shifts the conversation from what we're doing less of to what we're doing instead, right? Like for too long, the discussion of climate change has been use less fossil fuels, get off fossil fuels, and people get frustrated. Like, what am I actually moving towards? And this is the answer, that we are looking at, hoping to be building an electricity system that can deliver on our climate goals, to be adopting the technologies, things people can see and touch and use, electric vehicles, heat pumps, that are going to be the solution to climate change. So it's moving it to a more practical footing, and it comes with upsides. Jobs, investment, this is not all just cost. There's two sides to the ledger. So there's an opportunity to sort of reframe the climate change discussion, and I think the fact that we're talking about it here on your podcast is evidence of that.
So let's go with that. So the relationship between the consumer and the supply. In all of these things, should we just be building out the infrastructure and assuming that, you know, as they said in Field of Dreams, if we build it, they will come? Or do you sort of do it incrementally and gradually as people shift behavior? I'm thinking about, for instance, electric vehicles and charging stations. Obviously, one of the real impediments to take up is people's concern that they might run out of battery length, and they don't see a charging station as frequently as they see a gas station. So there's an insecurity about that. Should we just as a country just be going out and building these things everywhere so that they're ubiquitous, way out of proportion to the number of electric vehicles that are out there, and wait for the electric vehicles to come, or do we do it like we're doing it?
I mean, I think absolutely we should be building that network. It's a chicken and egg problem where the private sector is going to wait till there's enough electric vehicles to really build out the network, and consumers are going to wait till the network's well developed enough. So I think breaking that logjam by building a network makes a lot of sense. When you're talking about the electricity system itself, I think you do kind of want to keep pace with demand. You don't want to massively overbuild a system in anticipation of demand that's only starting to come on. At the same time, all of this takes long enough that we have to begin today and move aggressively to keep pace with demand as it's coming online. Because it's sort of a nightmare scenario where right as people are starting to use these electric technologies, the system's strained under the pressure. you get price problems, reliability problems, and support evaporates. So we need to be moving on all these fronts for sure.
Okay. So at the end of this conversation, I feel like I've learned a lot, but I still feel like I'm having trouble getting my arms around this thing. So if we were going to be, my old boss, Paul Martin, had this brilliant communications vehicle for the deficit, and it was 2-year rolling targets. Okay? So he said, in 2 years, we're going to have the deficit at X, and I'm going to meet that target no matter what, and I'm going to report to you on having met it. I feel, when I came in here, I said, I don't know if any of this is happening and how it's happening. It strikes right at the core of my confidence that we will address climate change, or that Canada, any of this is meaningful that I'm hearing about or reading about. So as that kind of lay consumer, I'm asking all three of you this question. What should I be looking for in activity in the next 2 or 3 years that would make me think that we're at least on track on some of the things we've talked about today?
I think one of the we talked a little bit about it, but I think as consumers, it's where it touches you. So next time you buy a car, are you thinking seriously about an electric vehicle? And does government provide incentives for you to get into an electric vehicle? And are you seeing the charging stations build up? A good friend of mine lives in a condo. He's been trying to convince his condo board to get a charging station in the condo. Can't do it. So, you know, all these multi-resident units need to get charging stations. So is that happening? You know, the next time my furnace dies, am I starting to think about a heat pump? And are the suppliers of furnaces selling me a heat pump?
Right.
And that will give me an idea. Carbon pricing and the check that it was so badly managed when they were sending it on your tax return, and now are sending you smartly a check in the mail. You know, do I see that, and do maybe I start realizing that gas price, there's a reason I'm getting this check, and there's an issue here. And the other thing, and you know, to go back to Greg's piece about the First World War, you know, and the Second World War, it is a war footing. And
we're not on that, though.
We are not
on
no,
that.
I know. I know we're not on it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of level of communication, and it frustrates the hell out of me to listen to the environmentalists tell us that this is, you know, an oil industry problem, and don't tell citizens that they have to change their individual citizens, that they have to change their behavior because that's not really where the problem is. No. We're all part of the problem. We all need to be part of the solution, and it's up for government and industry leaders to reinforce that message over and over and over again. And this idea that, oh, people don't want to hear it. Did people want to hear that we're going to war against Germany in 1939? I doubt it.
Right. Greg, I don't know about, I don't know in terms of this war footing idea. I want you to answer my question about what progress you'd see, but on this war footing idea, I don't know that ordinary people still understand what their role in this is supposed to be.
No, but I don't think it's been framed, honestly. I mean, the most important thing that the average person can do is ask their government what the plan is and how much progress are they making. And I think the degree to which you were talking about that rolling 2-year target, you know, insofar as our government goals are in 2030 or 2040 or 2050, that's a long time coming, and I'm not going to worry much about it. To the degree to which we can create more transparency about progress to date, because the truth is, in our daily lives, we won't see a big difference anytime soon, right? We have these big supply chain problems. So, you know, we just bought a new car, or we bought a car that's new to us. And we initially started by looking for electrics, and they basically laughed, right? Like, there are no electrics. To buy a new electric is just, you know, it's like buy a lottery ticket, maybe one day it'll pay off. So we ended up going with a plug-in hybrid that was used. Yeah. It's made a dramatic difference to how much money we spend on gas. Because even though we can't go 400 kilometers on electric charge, we can do all of our daily trips fully electric.
Right.
Right? Then we come home and we plug it in for a couple pennies. And we're saving money and saving the planet. Now, you can't do that in everything. I'm not pretending that there isn't going to be a real cost for the average person as we ramp up on this, but there are short-term wins. And I think, again, to the degree to which we are offering carrots to say that it's worth something to us for you to do something that will help the future of this country and this world. And here's a check. Like, here's cash in your jeans if you do the right thing.
Right.
And I think when that starts happening, we'll start accelerating.
Cool. Thanks. And Jason, what would you encourage me to look for as the benchmarks over the next few years that something's really moving?
I would say an energy plan from your provincial government. Does that government have a plan for building an energy system that is aligned with net zero by 2050? Even climate progressive governments, they may have a climate plan, what they see happening with GHGs. What that means for the energy system isn't always clear. And we're hearing this from utilities and regulators that there are just simply too many ways to get to net zero. You can't just leave us with an open-ended task like that. There have to be some guardrails. And so a provincial government that steps up and picks a lane, doesn't have to be overly prescriptive, right? Leave that to the utilities and regulators, but that sets a course for here's the sort of generation mix we're imagining, here's the role for different technologies, here's how much we might or might not pursue integration with our neighbors. Now we're starting to get real, right? That is a tangible plan. And Ontario used to do this sort of thing. The way they did it is on ice. Hopefully they're going to come back soon with a revised approach to this. But this is where the rubber meets the road. And I think until we have concrete energy plans from provincial governments, parts of this are just going to keep spinning their wheels. That's a tangible thing I think citizens can look for and ask for.
Excellent. Listen, on that note, I think we should wrap up. It's been great chatting with you about this. I'm sure that if the people in this room are all experts, the listeners to my podcast will have learned a tremendous amount from this, and I learned a lot from it. So I want to thank you three people. I want to thank the sponsors of my podcast, the presenting sponsor, TELUS, and CN, Rail, and Google. I'd really like to thank Electricity Canada for having us, especially Farhan Mirza and Lauren Walker, who facilitated this. I really appreciate your efforts and work on this. And all of you for being here and listening to us today. Thank you so much. This was a real pleasure to be here, and I hope you found it valuable. Take care.